The air in the gym smelled of sweat and rubber, a familiar scent that used to fill him with energy, purpose, and determination. But today it was different. The clang of weights hitting the floor, the rhythmic thump of feet pounding the treadmill, all of it felt like distant echoes, nothing more than background noise to the weight of his thoughts. He used to thrive here. The gym had been his sanctuary, a place where every rep, every set, every drop of sweat was a step closer to greatness. But now it felt like the last place on earth he wanted to be. He looked at himself in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him. A younger version of the man he used to be, full of ambition, drive, and the burning belief that anything was possible. Now all he saw was a shell. His muscles, once defined and powerful, seemed softer. His posture had slumped. The shoulders that had once been proud now rounded, weighed down by more than just physical fatigue. He wasn't the champion he had once imagined himself to be. He was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't know how to get back to who he used to be. It hadn't always been like this. Just a year ago, he had been on top of the world, a rising star in his sport. There had been a fire inside him, an unrelenting drive to be the best. He pushed through every training session like it was his last, fueled by the idea that the world was waiting for him to conquer it. He had the talent, the physique, the dedication. He was set to achieve greatness, the kind of greatness that made people remember your name forever. But then, things began to unravel. The first injury had been small, a nagging pain in his knee that he tried to ignore. He told himself it was nothing. Every athlete dealt with it. He powered through, training harder, ignoring the warning signs. But the pain didn't go away. It grew worse. The knee gave out during a crucial training session, sending him to the ground with a pain he hadn't expected. A doctor's visit revealed a tear in the ligament. Surgery was required, and the road to recovery was long and uncertain. He spent months on the sidelines, watching as his competition moved forward without him. He tried to stay positive, telling himself it would be just a temporary setback, a brief pause before he came back stronger. But every day without training, without the rush of physical exertion, wore at him. His body grew weaker, his mind too. The injury was only the beginning. There were more setbacks, a torn muscle, another round of rehab, and finally the mental exhaustion. Each failed attempt to push past the limitations of his body chipped away at his resolve. He felt like a warrior whose armor had been cracked, someone who had fought so many battles and lost the will to keep fighting. The pressure, the expectations, the constant need to perform, all of it became too much. The dream he had worked so hard for seemed to slip further away with every failed attempt. What was the point of pushing on if he couldn't even trust his body to carry him? He started to avoid the gym. First, it was just a day or two, a break to clear his head. But those days turned into weeks and then months. The gym, once a second home, became a place he dreaded. He found himself sleeping in longer, making excuses to stay away, telling himself that recovery was a slow process. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his knee that needed healing. It was his spirit, his belief in himself. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain. It was the voice inside his head that told him it was over. That voice whispered that maybe he had reached his peak, and this was where his journey ended. It told him that the world wasn't waiting for him anymore, that he had been forgotten. His friends, his family, even his coaches tried to remind him of who he was, of how far he had come. But those words, no matter how well-intentioned, only felt like empty platitudes. They didn't understand. No one understood. And then there was the shame of not being able to keep up, of seeing his peers move forward while he stagnated. He would scroll through social media and see their achievements, their victories, their perfect bodies, and it would eat at him. He wanted to be happy for them, but all he could feel was resentment. It wasn't just jealousy. It was a deep, gnawing sense of inadequacy. He had failed, and in the world of professional sports, failure was unforgivable. He looked at the gym's clock. It was nearly time for the next class to begin. A group of athletes stretching and preparing for their workout. They were the new generation, fresh faces with the same fire that he had once had. He watched them with a sense of longing, but also bitterness. The gym felt foreign to him now, a place for others to grow, to thrive. Not for him. A thought flickered in his mind. Maybe it was time to walk away. Maybe it was time to admit that his best days were behind him. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't cut out for this after all. The thought sent a shiver through him. The weight of it was heavy, suffocating. Walking away would be easier, but it didn't sit right. What was the point of all of this? The sacrifices, the years of sweat and pain, the endless hours of training. Was it all for nothing? Could he really just let it go? He sighed and glanced back at the mirror. The reflection that stared back at him was a stranger. But something in that stranger's eyes flickered with a faint, barely noticeable spark. Was it hope? Or was it just a faint trace of the person he used to be? It was then that he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Hey man," a familiar voice said. He turned and saw his old coach standing behind him. The coach had been a part of his journey from the very beginning, guiding him through his early victories and setbacks. The coach's eyes were full of concern, but also something else, an understanding that went deeper than words. "I know you're struggling right now," the coach said, his voice soft but firm. "But I also know you. I've seen what you're capable of. And this isn't the end for you." The athlete opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat felt tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but he couldn't find the right words. The coach smiled gently. "I've been where you are. I felt what you're feeling. But I also know that if you quit now, you'll never know what could have been. You're not done yet. Not by a long shot." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the athlete standing alone in the gym, his heart pounding. It wasn't much. It wasn't some grand gesture. But something in the coach's words had landed. For the first time in a long while, the athlete felt a small spark of something he hadn't felt in months, the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rise again. The following morning, the athlete found himself standing in front of the mirror again, the same mirror that had reflected a version of himself he no longer recognized. The gym was quieter now, the usual hustle and bustle of high-energy workouts replaced with a dull hum of machines in the background. But the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt suffocating. He stood there, staring at his own reflection, trying to summon the strength to move forward, to do something, anything to get back to who he used to be. But the truth was, he had no idea where to begin. His body ached just thinking about it. His knees still throbbed occasionally, and his muscles felt stiff, as if they had forgotten the rhythm of motion. But it wasn't just his body that was broken. It was his mind, his heart, and most importantly, his spirit. He had lost the drive that once fueled him. The fire that had once burned so brightly was now nothing more than a flickering ember, barely clinging to life. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his messages, hoping for a distraction, but all he found was more reminders of what he had lost. Text messages from friends who didn't know how to help, a few from his parents expressing their concern, and a notification from his coach about the upcoming competition he had no intention of attending. The athlete paused at that last message. He had avoided answering it for weeks now. The idea of stepping back into that world, of facing his fears and the possibility of failing in front of people who once looked up to him, was unbearable. Just as he was about to put his phone down, a notification popped up on his screen. It was from an event that had been advertised all over social media for the past week. Arnold Schwarzenegger Live, the mindset of champions. The words jumped off the screen, seizing his attention, and for a moment, he felt something stir inside him. Arnold Schwarzenegger. The name alone was enough to evoke images of dominance, of perseverance, of overcoming the impossible. He had watched movies with Arnold's powerful presence since he was a kid, admired him for his unyielding confidence and strength. Arnold was a figure larger than life, a man who had built his legacy from scratch, a man who had been knocked down more times than he could count but always rose again. The athlete hesitated. The last thing he wanted to do was hear some motivational speaker preach about greatness when he felt so far from it. But something about the idea of hearing Arnold speak intrigued him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a shred of wisdom that could break through the thick wall of doubt that had surrounded his heart. With a deep sigh, he made a decision. He bought a ticket for the event, still unsure of what to expect but desperate for something to shift. The day of the event arrived, and as the athlete entered the large auditorium, the buzz of anticipation in the air felt almost electric. The room was filled with a mix of people: young athletes, fitness enthusiasts, business leaders, and those simply searching for inspiration. He found a seat toward the back, hoping to remain unnoticed, unsure of what exactly he was seeking. His thoughts were a tangled mess. Was he looking for answers? Was he hoping Arnold would somehow fix what was broken inside him? Or was he just trying to recapture a small piece of his former self? The lights dimmed, and the crowd quieted, every eye drawn to the stage. When Arnold Schwarzenegger finally walked out, the crowd erupted into applause, a thunderous wave of admiration and excitement. The man who had been the symbol of strength, discipline, and success for decades stood before them, larger than life. Not just a bodybuilder, but a symbol of triumph in the face of adversity. He stood there for a moment, letting the applause wash over him, his presence commanding every corner of the room. When it finally subsided, Arnold began to speak, his voice smooth yet powerful, filling every inch of the room. "Everyone here is searching for something," Arnold began, his words calm yet intense, the kind of words that seemed to carry years of wisdom in every syllable. "We all have dreams, goals, and desires, and we all know the path isn't easy. But what sets the winners apart from the losers is not talent. It's the ability to keep moving forward when everyone else is ready to give up." The athlete sat up straighter, his mind focusing on the words. There was something in Arnold's voice that resonated deeply. It wasn't the boastful tone of someone who claimed to have all the answers. It was the voice of someone who had lived through the struggle, someone who had seen failure in its rawest form and learned how to rise from it. Arnold continued, recounting stories from his own life. How he had left Austria with nothing but a dream of becoming a champion. How he had faced ridicule and obstacles every step of the way. He told the audience about the years of training, the sacrifices, the moments when it seemed like everything was falling apart. But there was one thing Arnold had never done, one thing that had defined every success, every victory. He had never given up. Not when people told him he was too small. Not when he was told he would never make it in Hollywood. Not when he faced countless rejections and failures. He had kept going because he believed in himself even when no one else did. "Failure is part of the process," Arnold said, pausing to let the words settle. "The problem isn't failure. The problem is quitting. When you stop trying, when you stop pushing, that's when the game is over. I've been knocked down time and time again, but I've never stayed down. I've always gotten back up." The athlete felt a tightness in his chest, a knot forming as Arnold's words began to pierce through the fog of doubt that had clouded his mind for so long. Could it really be that simple? Could the key to all of this, to overcoming his struggles, be as simple as choosing to get back up no matter how many times he fell? Arnold went on to explain the importance of self-belief, not as a fleeting confidence, but as a foundation, a force that drives you forward even when the road ahead seems impossible. He spoke of the mental strength required to push through, how it was often more important than the physical strength. The mind, Arnold said, was the most powerful tool a person could possess. It was the mind that would tell you to quit, to give up, but it was also the mind that would push you through the darkest moments, if you let it. The athlete's heart raced as he absorbed every word. It was as if Arnold was speaking directly to him, addressing the pain, the doubt, the fears that had gripped him for so long. There was a fire kindling inside him, a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in ages. Maybe this was the spark he needed. Maybe Arnold's words were the key to unlocking what he thought was lost forever. As the seminar continued, Arnold spoke about the power of visualization, how he would see himself on the stage, winning the title, becoming a champion long before it ever happened. He talked about the importance of setting goals, of having a vision that was bigger than any setback. The athlete began to see his own journey in a new light. Perhaps he had been too focused on the failures, on the things that went wrong. He had lost sight of the bigger picture, of why he started in the first place. By the time Arnold finished his talk, the athlete was overwhelmed. His mind was racing with new possibilities, new perspectives. For the first time in a long time, He felt a small flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was fragile, just a spark, but it was there. And maybe that was all he needed. Just enough to reignite the fire that had once burned so brightly. As the crowd erupted into applause, the athlete stood up, clapping along with the others. But unlike before, there was something different in his heart. It wasn't just admiration for Arnold anymore. It was a quiet, resolute understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, he was capable of starting over. Arnold had shown him that even the greatest champions had faced their own battles. And if they could rise again, so could he. The days after Arnold's seminar passed in a blur. The athlete couldn't shake the words from his mind. They replayed in his thoughts constantly, even as he lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. Failure is part of the process. Don't stop trying. When you hit the wall, it's not the end. It's the beginning. They were simple phrases, yet they carried a weight that he hadn't realized he had been searching for. But what was more striking was the realization that, in Arnold's words, he hadn't just heard advice. He had felt a shift in his mindset. At first, he didn't know where to start. The gym still felt foreign to him, like a place for someone else, someone who had never experienced defeat. But he knew one thing for sure. If he was going to make any progress, he had to go back. Not for anyone else, but for himself. He began small, taking baby steps back into his routine. It wasn't easy. The gym was still a place where his mind flooded with doubts, where the ghost of past failures loomed over him like a shadow, reminding him of every missed opportunity and every injury that had brought him to this point. But he couldn't allow that to control him. Arnold had made it clear. Failure wasn't the enemy, quitting was. The first day back, he started with light cardio. Just 10 minutes on the treadmill, nothing too demanding, but enough to get his body moving again. It was harder than he expected. His muscles felt stiff, and his knee throbbed, as if to remind him that the old injuries weren't completely healed. But instead of retreating, instead of letting the pain convince him to stop, he kept going. He ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the rhythm of his feet against the belt, the steady pace of his breath. He wasn't going to let it define him. The next few days, he increased his training incrementally, slowly working his way back into the exercises he used to do with ease. The first time he tried to lift weights again, his arms trembled under the pressure, and he could barely manage half of the weight he had once been able to handle without breaking a sweat. The frustration crept in, threatening to drown him. His mind told him to quit, that he wasn't the same person anymore. But he thought back to Arnold's words. "You're not done yet. Not by a long shot." With each small victory, lifting a heavier weight, running a longer distance, doing one more rep than he did yesterday, the athlete's confidence began to rebuild. The physical progress was slow, almost agonizingly so, but it was progress. His body was waking up from its long slumber, reawakening the strength he had once taken for granted. However, the real battle wasn't physical. It was mental. Every time he stood in front of the mirror, his reflection reminded him of how far he still had to go. His muscles weren't as defined as they had been. His form wasn't as sharp, and the fatigue still weighed on him. The athlete was caught between two forces: the desire to keep pushing forward and the constant self-doubt that whispered in his ear, telling him he was wasting his time, that he would never return to the level he once had. But something inside him had changed. He was no longer afraid of the struggle. He had spent so long avoiding pain and failure that he had forgotten what it felt like to fight for something. Arnold had taught him that the struggle was where growth happened. The discomfort, the setbacks, the obstacles, they weren't signs that he should quit. They were signs that he was on the right path. He needed to fight through it, to embrace it, not to turn away. As the days turned into weeks, the athlete's routine began to solidify. He trained with focus and purpose, but he also allowed himself the space to be imperfect. The injuries that had once felt like insurmountable barriers now seemed like temporary challenges, inconveniences to work through, not excuses to give up. He learned to listen to his body, to give it the rest it needed, but also to push it when it was capable of more. And slowly, very slowly, his body began to respond. His knee felt stronger, his muscles more awake, his endurance building. One evening, after another grueling workout, The athlete stood in the gym, drenched in sweat, breathing heavily. He looked around, and for the first time in months he didn't feel out of place. He felt like he belonged here. It wasn't just the physical progress that had brought him this feeling. It was the mental shift. For the first time, he wasn't just training his body. He was training his mind, teaching himself that failure was not the end, but a part of the journey. The next day, as he rested between sets, his coach appeared beside him, as he often did after particularly intense sessions. The coach watched him for a moment, his eyes scanning the athlete's form, taking in the progress, the focus. "You're doing well," the coach said with a nod, though his tone was not one of surprise. "I knew you had it in you." The athlete looked at his coach, a question lingering on his lips. "But what if I'm never the same as I was? What if I can't get back to where I was?" The coach smiled gently, almost knowingly, and sat down next to him. "You'll never be the same as you were. But that's not the point, is it? You've been through something. You've had to dig deeper than you ever have before. And that's where the real strength comes from the journey, not the destination. If you only ever focus on getting back to where you were, you'll miss the opportunity to become something greater." The athlete felt a wave of understanding wash over him. His coach was right. He wasn't trying to return to an old version of himself. He wasn't chasing the past. He was building something new, stronger, wiser, more resilient. The athlete had spent so long wishing to turn back time, to recapture a version of himself that was lost. But what he needed to do now was to look forward. The journey ahead was still long, and the path would never be easy, but it was his to walk. It always had been. In the following days, he pushed himself harder. His workouts became more intense, but with a newfound sense of purpose. He felt the power of his body returning, but it was the strength of his mind that truly set him apart now. Every time doubt crept in, he remembered Arnold's words, "You can't stop at failure. You can't stop at disappointment. You can't stop at what other people say. Keep moving forward." And he did. Every rep, every set, every run, he kept moving forward. The transformation was slow, but it was undeniable. His body began to regain its former shape, and the strength that had once been his signature returned, even better than before. But more than that, he started to feel alive again, the way he had once felt when he first started his journey. The fire inside him was rekindled, and this time, it wasn't just the hunger for victory that fueled him. It was the understanding that the struggle, the pain, the doubts, they were all part of the process. And as long as he kept moving forward, nothing could stop him. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, he looked at himself in the mirror once again. The reflection staring back at him was different. Not perfect, not flawless, but stronger, more determined. The man in the mirror had been through hell, and yet here he was still standing. Not the same as before, but something better. He smiled to himself. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And this time he truly believed it. The days bled into weeks, and the athlete found himself in a strange, almost liminal space between who he had been and who he was becoming. His body, slowly but surely, was regaining its former strength. The aches and pains that had once kept him sidelined were gradually fading. His muscles were waking up, becoming firm and defined again. The physical progress was undeniable. But deep down, the athlete knew that it wasn't enough to just fix his body. He had to fix his mind, too. And that was the hard part. No matter how many sets he completed, no matter how many miles he ran, the voice in his head that had once whispered doubt and fear now roared louder than ever. Every time he faced a challenge, whether it was lifting a weight he once considered easy or pushing through an intense sprint, his mind would tell him, "You can't do this. You're not strong enough. You'll never be the same again." The weight of that internal battle was often heavier than the dumbbells he lifted. It wasn't the physical exertion that wore him down. It was the constant mental war. He had learned to silence the doubts momentarily, to push past them during his workouts. But when the training ended, when he was alone with his thoughts, that old feeling of being lost crept back in. One afternoon, after another grueling training session, he sat on the bench, exhausted and drenched in sweat. His muscles burned, His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that consumed him. It was the uncertainty. He wasn't sure how much further he could go. He had reached a plateau in his progress, and with every small success came the lingering fear that it wasn't enough. He couldn't shake the feeling that his body was playing catch-up with his past self, but his mind was still trapped in the past, reliving every failure, every injury, every moment of self-doubt. He wanted to keep moving forward, to rise above it all, but it felt like the weight of his fears was dragging him back down. That evening, as he prepared to leave the gym, he spotted a familiar face walking toward him. His coach, as usual, stepping out of the shadows to check on him after a particularly tough session. His coach had been there through the highs and lows, and today there was something different in the way he looked at the athlete. It wasn't just the pride of seeing improvement. There was something deeper there, as if he knew the athlete was facing a deeper battle, one that wasn't just physical. "You look like you've been through hell," the coach remarked, sitting down next to him on the bench. The athlete let out a dry chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "You have no idea. I feel like I'm stuck." "Stuck?" The coach raised an eyebrow, his voice soft but curious. "In what way?" The athlete exhaled sharply, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been making progress, sure. My body's getting back in shape, but my mind, I can't get past the doubts, the fears. It's like I'm always running from something. I don't know how to quiet those voices anymore." The coach didn't respond immediately. He sat there, watching the athlete as if considering his words carefully. "You know, I've seen that look in your eyes before," he said after a moment. "It's the same look I had when I was younger, when I first started. You've put in the work, but now you have to fight the hardest battle. The battle inside your head." The athlete turned toward him, confusion written across his face. "What do you mean?" The coach smiled slightly, his eyes distant for a moment as if recalling a time long ago. "When I was starting out, I was driven by fear of failing, fear of being nothing. But what I didn't realize was that the fear I was fighting against was actually the thing that could push me to greatness. Fear, doubt, pain. They aren't things to run from. They're things to use. If you let them, they'll sharpen you, make you stronger than you ever thought possible." The athlete shook his head slowly, still struggling to understand. "But what if I don't have it in me? What if I've already hit my peak and I'm just too broken to go any further?" The coach's gaze softened. "You're thinking too much about the past. You're holding on to what you were, and it's keeping you from seeing who you can become. The greatest athletes, the greatest people, they aren't defined by the titles they've earned, the wins they've racked up. They're defined by their ability to fight when everything in them says to quit. They're defined by their ability to use their failures as fuel." The athlete exhaled a long breath, feeling the weight of the coach's words sink in. It was hard, so hard, to let go of the idea of being who he had once been. The champion, the unstoppable force, the athlete who had it all. But he had to admit, he wasn't that person anymore. The idea of returning to that version of himself was tempting, but it was also a trap. It wasn't about returning to an old self. It was about becoming something new. Stronger, yes, but also wiser. Resilient. Unbreakable in a different way. The coach continued. "Every champion has their moment of doubt. It's not the absence of fear or uncertainty that makes you strong. It's the courage to keep moving forward despite it. You're right. Your body isn't what it used to be. But you know what? You're stronger than you were before. Because now you've learned how to get back up when the world knocks you down. And that's something the old you never knew." The athlete sat in silence for a while, processing the coach's words. They weren't just comforting words. They were truths that dug deep into his soul. He had been so focused on the idea of returning to his former self that he had failed to see the power in moving beyond that. He wasn't the same, and that was okay. He didn't need to be the same. He needed to evolve, to grow, to adapt to what the world had thrown at him. With every passing day, the athlete had learned that progress wasn't linear. It wasn't about one straight path to success, but rather a series of steps. Forward, backward, sideways, but always with the understanding that moving forward, no matter how slow or imperfect, was still moving towards something greater. But there was still fear. there was still doubt, and as much as he tried to ignore it, it crept in during his toughest moments. It was at night, when the gym was quiet and the silence settled around him, that the doubts came rushing in. But now, when those thoughts tried to overwhelm him, he fought back. He focused on his breath, on his next step, on the small victories that made all the difference. "I'm not done yet," he told himself every day. "I am not broken. I am just in the middle of my journey." The next morning, as he prepared for another workout, the athlete felt a familiar surge of nerves. But this time, he didn't allow the fear to control him. He put on his gear, walked into the gym, and got to work. Every lift, every run, every drop of sweat was now part of a larger process. He wasn't the same person he had been before, and that was okay. He was becoming something stronger, something better, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that the victory wasn't in the destination. The victory was in the journey. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, and he would keep fighting no matter what. The day of the competition arrived, and the athlete felt something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. A nervous excitement, a thrill that ran through his veins like electricity. For months, he had been focused on one thing: getting back to a place where he could prove to himself that he was capable of greatness once again. This wasn't just another event. This was his moment to test everything he had learned, everything he had fought for. Standing at the edge of the arena, the athlete looked around at the other competitors, each one brimming with their own confidence, their own determination. They looked like champions, seasoned, ready for the challenge. He could feel the weight of their gazes, but he didn't flinch. His body felt strong, his muscles tight and responsive. He had trained for this. But it wasn't just the physical preparation that mattered. What had gotten him here, what had brought him to this moment, was the mental strength he had been building day by day. The fear that had once crippled him, the doubts that had plagued his every step, they still lingered, but they no longer had control over him. He stepped into the arena, the noise of the crowd swirling around him, a distant roar that seemed to fade into the background as he focused on the task ahead. He could hear his coach's voice in his mind, steady and reassuring. "You're not here to be perfect. You're here to prove that you've learned how to rise when the world knocks you down. The win isn't in the trophy, it's in how you move forward no matter what." The athlete took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline. The competition was fierce, the stakes high, but for the first time, he didn't feel the crushing pressure that had once threatened to paralyze him. He had faced so many obstacles to get here, both physical and mental, that nothing could feel impossible now. He had already won, in a sense. The fact that he was standing here, competing again, meant that he had conquered the battle within himself. The first event began. It was a strength test, a series of heavy lifts that tested both power and endurance. The athlete approached the barbell, his hands gripping the cold steel. He could feel his heart pounding, a steady rhythm that reminded him he was alive, that this was the moment he had worked for. The lift was heavier than he remembered, but it was also familiar. He had done this thousands of times in training, in practice. But now, with the pressure of the competition on his shoulders, everything felt amplified. The weight on the bar felt like the weight of every failure, every setback, every moment he had questioned his ability to keep going. For a moment, his mind tried to pull him back into that dark place, the place where doubt and fear ruled. But then he thought of Arnold's voice, calm and steady. "You are the only one who can stop you. Don't listen to that voice. Every failure is just another step to greatness." He shook off the doubts and focused. He lifted the bar with controlled power, feeling the strain in his muscles but also a deep sense of resolve. He made the first lift with ease, then the second, and finally the third. Each lift, each rep, was more than just a physical movement. It was a statement that he wasn't the same man who had walked into the gym months ago. He wasn't the man who had been broken by injury or defeated by his own mind. He was something more now. The crowd cheered as he completed the challenge, but the athlete didn't hear them. He only heard his own breath, steady and strong, a reminder that he was here, present in this moment. This was the victory, not the applause, not the trophies, but the knowledge that he had conquered the one thing that had nearly destroyed him: his own doubt. The events continued, each one testing him in different ways. Sprinting, agility challenges, and endurance drills that pushed him to his limits. Each test felt like an opportunity, not a threat. He approached them with the same focus and determination, taking everything he had learned in the past few months and channeling it into each movement. There were moments when his body screamed in pain, when his legs felt like they might give out, but he remembered what his coach had said. The pain isn't a sign that you're weak. It's a sign that you're pushing yourself beyond what you thought was possible. By the time the final event rolled around, a grueling, high-intensity challenge that required both physical strength and mental endurance, the athlete was exhausted. His muscles ached. His breath came in heavy gasps, but something inside him was still pushing him forward. The finish line was in sight, and though it felt like the hardest thing he had ever done, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to quit. The final challenge was designed to test every ounce of his endurance. A long-distance run followed by a series of obstacle courses, each one more difficult than the last. As he ran, every step felt like it took him deeper into the pain, deeper into his limits. But with each obstacle, he pushed through, finding the strength to keep moving even when his legs felt like lead. And then, just when he thought he might collapse, he reached the last hurdle. It was a high wall, designed to test not only physical strength but mental toughness. He had seen others struggle with it, hesitate, doubt whether they could make the jump. For a moment, he felt that familiar wave of fear rising within him, the thought that maybe this was where he would fall short. But then he remembered what Arnold had said. When you hit the wall, it's not the end, it's the beginning. You have the power to climb over it. With a determined shout, he ran toward the wall, his muscles screaming in protest. But he didn't stop. He reached the base, pushed off the ground, and propelled himself upwards with every last ounce of strength he had left. His fingers gripped the top of the wall, and for a second he thought he might slip, but he held on, pulling himself over and landing on the other side with a grunt. The finish line was ahead. His body was exhausted. His mind was running on fumes, but something within him refused to quit. He pushed through the last stretch, crossing the finish line with a final burst of energy. The crowd erupted in applause, but he barely noticed. The only thing that mattered was the feeling of triumph inside him, the knowledge that he had fought, not just for the win, but for the belief in himself that had been lost for so long. He had done it. As the competition ended, the athlete stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he had won first place. In truth, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had won something far more important. He had proved to himself that he was capable of overcoming anything. Not just physical challenges, but the mental and emotional battles that had threatened to hold him back. He found his coach in the crowd, watching him with a proud smile. The athlete walked over, still breathing heavily, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had something to prove to himself, not to anyone else. "You did it," the coach said, his voice full of pride. The athlete nodded, still catching his breath. "Yeah, I did. But it wasn't just about winning today. It was about proving that I could still fight." His coach smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Exactly. The fight never ends. And as long as you keep fighting, you'll keep growing. Today was just the beginning." As the athlete looked out at the crowd, he realized that the victory wasn't just about crossing the finish line. It was about every step, every moment of doubt, every piece of fear that he had faced and overcome. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready for whatever came next.